Think about how we navigate our relationships every single day. Sometimes it feels, well, pretty smooth, right? And other times it can feel a bit like you're on a collision course.
Yeah, definitely.
And a lot of that really comes down to something we call boundaries.
Right, boundaries.
Imagine them like property lines around a house, maybe.
Yeah,
Or even just that personal space bubble we all kind of have.
that's a good way to put it.
Understanding these boundaries, yours, and the boundaries of the people you care about, it's so crucial for feeling, grounded and respected.
And connected.
And connected,
Yeah.
exactly. Instead of constantly feeling drained or misunderstood.
That's a really insightful way to frame it. Today, we're going to dive deep into this really essential topic.
Okay.
Think of this session maybe as us sitting down together to really get a handle on the landscape of your relationship boundaries.
Right. Like mapping it out.
Exactly. We'll be focusing on what we often see as three core types: rigid, diffused, and healthy boundaries. We'll be drawing from our experience and, various resources to offer some clarity.
Clarity on how these actually play out in your life. Yeah, our goal today is to explore these three types: rigid, diffused, healthy. Not just as like abstract ideas.
No, much more practical than that.
Right. We want to really understand how they show up in your day-to-day interactions and, importantly, what kind of impact they're having on your relationships.
Okay.
So let's start maybe with rigid boundaries. What comes to mind for you when you hear that term?
Rigid boundaries. Well, as the name suggests, they're like very firm, almost impenetrable walls.
Yeah.
And in the context of relationships, this often translates to a pretty consistent no. Not always said out loud necessarily,
Right.
but more like an underlying approach to connection, a default setting of keep out.
Right. It's definitely more than just being able to say no to, like a favor or something.
Oh.
It's this broader way of relating where it can be really, really tough to let people in emotionally. There might be this deep-seated difficulty in trusting others, almost like you're waiting for disappointment.
Precisely, expecting it even. And this can show up as, a real reluctance to share personal thoughts or feelings, and sometimes even a tendency to just dismiss the concerns or opinions of others. It might feel like protection.
Like you're keeping yourself safe.
Right. But that wall, it can become quite isolating over time. Do you ever find yourself feeling like there's a part of you that nobody really sees?
That definitely resonates. One of the things we've looked at talks about that exact feeling of loneliness that can come with rigid boundaries.
Yeah.
That sense that you're not really known by the people around you. And it makes sense, doesn't it? If you're always keeping people at arm's length.
How can they know you?
Exactly. It's hard to build that genuine understanding.
Exactly. It's like that analogy someone used of a person living inside a solid concrete structure.
Yeah.
Safe, maybe, but also completely cut off from the outside world.
Yeah.
And if we think about specific examples, someone with rigid boundaries might frequently say to themselves, I truly trust very few people in my life.
That internal monologue.
Right. Or even say out loud, other people's problems, they're none of my concern. There's a real sense of emotional self-reliance, but taken to an extreme.
And it can show up in everyday things too, right? Like just thinking about asking for help.
Oh, huge.
That can feel like a massive vulnerability. Or being really guarded about personal belongings, maybe.
Definitely. Protecting your stuff.
And even in romantic relationships, we often see difficulties with, open, honest communication. It just sounds exhausting, maintaining that level of vigilance.
It is. It's emotionally and energetically really taxing. And it's worth noting how others might perceive someone with these kinds of boundaries.
Right, from the outside looking in.
Yeah. Sometimes it can come across as maybe perfectionism or a know-it-all attitude.
Or maybe even jealousy.
Jealousy, yeah. There might be a real discomfort with anything new or unfamiliar. And as we've touched on, intimacy in relationships, that can be a real challenge.
Okay, so what often leads someone to develop these kinds of rigid boundaries? What's the sort of the purpose behind building that wall?
Often it's rooted in past experiences, maybe rejection or being hurt badly.
Ah, okay. Protection.
Exactly. The rigidity becomes a way to sort of preemptively protect oneself from future pain. It's like a learned response to create a sense of control in situations that feel potentially vulnerable.
But that control,
Mm-hmm.
it comes at a pretty significant cost in terms of connection, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The trade-off is often a lack of the very close, intimate relationships that can bring so much richness and support to our lives. It ends up being a narrower experience of human connection.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember, too, that these rigid boundaries might not be consistent across all relationships.
Oh, that's a good point.
You might be very guarded in one area of your life, say romantically, but maybe a bit more open with close friends or perhaps family. It varies.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always black and white, is it?
Yeah.
Now, thinking about family dynamics,
Mm-hmm.
how do rigid boundaries typically play out there?
In families, rigid boundaries can create a lot of emotional distance, a lack of real engagement between members.
Like everyone's in their own silo.
Pretty much. Communication tends to be limited, maybe superficial, and expressing emotions can feel unsafe or even sort of forbidden. It's almost like everyone is living under their own separate roof, but within the same house.
Wow. So not just a wall around the individual, but walls going up between the people who are supposed to be closest.
Precisely. And when these rigid boundaries are crossed, even accidentally,
Oh.
the reaction can be quite intense. Often it shows up as anger or defensiveness or just complete emotional withdrawal.
Shutting down.
Exactly. The boundary is so inflexible that any perceived intrusion is met with pretty significant resistance.
Okay. That gives us a really clear picture of rigid boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Now, should we shift gears? Let's look at the other end of the spectrum. Diffused boundaries. What are your initial thoughts on that?
Diffuse boundaries.
Oh,
Well, the opposite of that concrete wall feels almost like having, no walls at all.
yeah.
Just everything blending together.
That's a very accurate image. Diffused boundaries are characterized by a real lack of clarity, lack of distinctness between individuals.
Okay.
People with this style often struggle, really struggle, to say no. And while they might not consciously know where their own boundaries even are,
Mm-hmm.
they often feel a sense of discomfort or even resentment when those unspoken limits get crossed.
So they might agree to something.
Yep.
But then feel really resentful or taken advantage of later on.
Exactly that. Saying no can feel incredibly difficult. It often leads to a pattern of overcommitment.
Mm-hmm.
There can be a tendency to be overly agreeable, maybe even passive in relationships, and sometimes an inclination to trust others very, very quickly,
Yeah.
perhaps overlooking some red flags.
It sounds like there might be a real difficulty in prioritizing their own needs and desires,
Yeah.
like their own stuff gets lost.
Absolutely. You might see someone with diffused boundaries really hesitant to express a different opinion
Mm-hmm.
or even contribute their own ideas because they're afraid of upsetting someone or jeopardizing the connection.
So keeping the peace is paramount.
Right. Maintaining harmony, even at their own expense, becomes the primary focus.
And that often translates to saying yes, even when it goes against their own comfort level or maybe drains their energy completely. I can see how that would lead to feeling constantly depleted,
Yeah.
just running on empty.
It really does. And there's often this underlying expectation, and maybe unconscious, that others will somehow just know and meet all their emotional needs.
Right. Mind reading.
Kinda. And unfortunately, this can sometimes lead to accepting disrespectful or even abusive behavior,
Wow.
all in an attempt to just preserve the relationship, to not rock the boat.
Because setting a limit or challenging the other person feels way too threatening to the connection itself.
Precisely. And this can extend further, like becoming overly involved in the problems of others, taking on their burdens as if they were their own.
Mm-hmm. Carrying the weight of the world.
Yeah. Or the flip side, allowing others to become excessively involved in their personal life,
Yes.
blurring those lines of personal responsibility.
Right, right. And the idea you mentioned earlier, emotional contagion, feeling everyone else's emotions so intensely.
Oh, yeah.
That must just be amplified with diffused boundaries.
It really is. Without a clear sense of where your own emotional experience ends and someone else's begins,
Yeah.
you can easily become overwhelmed by the feelings of those around you. It leads to significant emotional distress.
That sounds exhausting too, just in a different way than the rigid boundaries.
It is. And then there's the tendency to overshare personal information.
Ah, okay. TMI.
Exactly. They might share really intimate details with people they barely know, or sometimes even with people who've hurt them in the past.
Why would that happen?
Well, It often stems from a lack of a strong internal filter about what's appropriate to share and with whom. And as we often see, individuals with diffuse boundaries can be, unfortunately, more susceptible to being taken advantage of.
It creates a real vulnerability, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What are some of the common phrases or maybe internal thoughts that might signal diffused boundaries?
You might hear things like, oh, it's so hard for me to say no,
Okay.
or the opinions of others, they affect me more deeply than I'd like to admit.
Hmm.
There's often a history maybe of tolerating disrespect or even abuse, perhaps out of fear, and a recognition of frequently oversharing.
Yeah.
You might also hear something like, I tend to change my behavior really quickly just to please others, which highlights how that external validation often takes precedence over their own internal cues.
Okay. So what are some of the underlying factors? What contributes to developing these very porous boundaries?
Several factors can be at play here. Often there's a deep-seated feeling of being maybe less worthy or inferior, a fear of losing connection or being abandoned if they assert themselves. Sometimes a belief that their value lies primarily in their ability to give and please others.
Their worth is tied to what they do for others.
Exactly. There can also be a less defined sense of self, just a fuzziness about who they are, making it difficult to even identify their own needs and limits. And that pervasive fear of rejection if they don't comply with what others seem to expect.
It sounds like so many of these behaviors are really driven by a fear of loss, fear of not being loved.
Precisely. And just like with rigid boundaries, family dynamics often play a significant role.
Right. How does that look with diffused boundaries in a family?
In families with diffused boundaries, we often see something called enmeshment.
Enmeshment. Okay.
Yeah. It means there's a lack of healthy separation between family members. One person's emotional state can become intensely dependent on the others. Individual autonomy is often discouraged or maybe even actively suppressed.
Can you give an example?
Sure, like a child might feel responsible for their parents' happiness. Or maybe siblings feel they have to have all the same feelings about things.
Okay. So just as rigid boundaries create distance, diffused boundaries can create this kind of unhealthy closeness where individual identities and needs just get blurred together.
Exactly. And as we've seen, diffused boundaries are often associated with people-pleasing tendencies and frequently lower self-esteem,
Mm.
which unfortunately can increase the risk of entering into codependent or even abusive relationships. That lack of clear personal limits just makes it easier for others to overstep.
Okay. So we've got rigid walls on one side and almost no walls on the other.
Hmm. Now, having looked at these two extremes, let's turn our attention to what we're actually aiming for.
Yeah.
Healthy boundaries. What does that look like in practice?
Healthy boundaries. Yeah, that sounds like the sweet spot, doesn't it? The middle ground where you're connected, but you also have a really strong sense of yourself.
That's a perfect way to put it. Healthy boundaries involve drawing flexibly from both sides, the ability to be open and the ability to set limits.
Oh, yeah.
Using these skills in a way that's appropriate and beneficial, both for your relationships and for your own well-being. It's about balance.
So it's about knowing when to open up and connect and
Mhm.
also knowing when to create that necessary space and maybe say no.
Exactly. It means being able to say no to requests that don't align with your priorities, or maybe requests that would just overextend you
Mm,
without feeling excessive guilt or this big fear of negative repercussions.
right.
It also involves being able to navigate disagreements assertively, clearly expressing your needs and values while still respecting the perspectives of others.
And it's about being selective, isn't it?
Yeah.
About who you allow into your inner circle.
Yeah.
Not holding everyone at a distance like the rigid style,
Right.
but also not being completely indiscriminate about intimacy, like the diffused style.
Precisely. There's a sense of discernment, self-awareness. Healthy boundaries also enable you to maintain a strong sense of your own identity, your thoughts, feelings, values.
Knowing who you are.
Yes, while still being able to adapt and be flexible in different situations and relationships.
So it's really about knowing who you are, what matters to you, and being able to communicate that effectively to other people.
Absolutely. It involves being comfortable with both intimacy and autonomy, being able to open yourself up to close relationships, while also knowing when and how to protect your own emotional, mental, and even physical space.
And in family dynamics, healthy boundaries must just create a much more respectful and supportive environment, I imagine.
They really do. Clear and healthy boundaries within a family allow for individual growth and autonomy, while still fostering connection and mutual respect.
Mm-hmm.
People feel safe to express their thoughts and feelings openly, which in turn strengthens empathy and understanding between everyone.
Okay. what are some telltale signs or maybe phrases that indicate someone is operating with generally healthy boundaries?
Well, you might hear someone say something like, I recognize my own needs, and I can communicate them clearly and
A
respectfully.
directness, yeah.
That direct and assertive communication. Also, maybe I can respect different viewpoints without having to abandon my own.
Mm.
That shows that balance of self and others.
Mhm.
And I'm able to offer support to loved ones without taking on their problems as my own or neglecting my own well-being. Highlighting that ability to be caring without total self-sacrifice.
Oh, that last one is so important, being supportive without just getting completely overwhelmed or burnt out.
Absolutely. Other examples might include, I understand that conflict is a normal part of relationships and I can address it directly,
Not avoiding it.
not avoiding it. And also, if I feel a boundary has been crossed, I will address it and work to prevent it from happening again. That demonstrates real self-awareness and the ability to advocate for yourself.
It really sounds like a key element. Underpinning all of this is a strong sense of self-respect.
Exactly. People with healthy boundaries, they're able to differentiate their own feelings from those of others.
Huh?
They can clearly articulate their needs, ask for space when they need it,
Hmm.
and they avoid taking responsibility for the emotions or behaviors of others. They don't feel compelled to constantly sacrifice their own needs just to gain approval. And crucially, they have a solid sense of who they are outside of their relationships.
And setting these healthy boundaries, what kind of ripple effect does that have on our relationships overall?
Well, it fosters greater autonomy and self-reliance, both for you and the other person. It sets clear and realistic expectations.
Right. No mind reading needed.
Exactly. And ultimately, it builds self-respect within the individuals involved. This leads to more comfortable, more equitable interactions. It clarifies individual responsibilities and helps everyone distinguish their own wants and needs from those of others.
It sounds like the absolute foundation for truly healthy and lasting connections. So how do these healthy boundaries actually develop? Is it something you're born with?
Not usually. They typically arise from a strong awareness of your own emotional, mental, and physical limits.
Okay. Self-awareness first.
Right. Combined with the ability to communicate these needs clearly and assertively, it's really an ongoing process of self-discovery and practicing effective communication.
And the benefits sound pretty significant.
Oh, absolutely. Healthy boundaries contribute to safer, more intimate, and ultimately much more fulfilling relationships. They can boost your self-esteem, reduce feelings of anxiety and stress, and enhance your overall well-being. They lead to more effective communication and relationships that are characterized by mutual respect and understanding, rather than resentment or constant conflict.
Yeah.
As we often see, healthy boundaries and a strong sense of self-worth are very closely intertwined.
It's almost like a positive feedback loop, isn't it?
Exactly.
Setting healthy boundaries reinforces your sense of self-worth, which then makes it easier to maintain those boundaries going forward.
That's it exactly. So, okay. We've explored rigid, diffused, and healthy boundaries. Now, let's maybe focus a bit on how you can begin to cultivate healthier boundaries in your own life.
Yeah, that's the crucial part, right? Recognizing where you might be leaning too far
Yeah.
in either direction, rigid or diffused, that feels like the very first step.
Precisely. And a key practice in moving towards healthier boundaries is developing your assertiveness skills.
Assertiveness, okay.
This involves learning to express your thoughts, your feelings, your needs clearly, respectfully, and confidently. It's about finding your voice and using it in a way that honors both yourself and others.
And it's not just about what you say, right? It's also about clearly defining your personal boundaries in the first place.
Knowing them yourself.
And then making sure that the people in your life are actually aware of them. People
Yeah.
can't respect limits they don't know exist.
That's so true. And remember, setting boundaries really has two essential components. There's communication, verbally expressing your needs assertively.
Okay, the talking part.
Right. And then there's action, consistently following through and upholding those boundaries in your behavior. Your actions really need to align with your words for boundaries to be effective.
That makes sense. You have to walk the talk. And it's important to remember, too, I guess, that as we change and our relationships evolve, our boundaries might need to adapt as well.
Absolutely. Boundaries aren't set in stone. They definitely can and often need to be adjusted as your circumstances change, as you grow, as your relationships grow. And when you do need to revise a boundary, clear and open communication is essential. Just making sure everyone understands the shift.
Now, for some people listening, the whole idea of setting boundaries can feel really uncomfortable, maybe even scary. What would you say to that?
That's a very common feeling, and it's perfectly valid. Setting boundaries can be challenging.
Yeah.
And you might experience some discomfort, both for yourself and possibly in the reactions of others who are maybe used to you operating with different, perhaps more diffused boundaries.
Right. They might push back.
They might. You might encounter some resistance, and it's really important to remember that this doesn't invalidate your need for that boundary.
Yeah.
Their reaction is about them, not about the rightness of your need.
Okay. So even if it feels awkward or there's some pushback, it's still a worthwhile and necessary process for your own well-being.
Absolutely. A helpful starting point can be to just reflect on different areas of your life where you feel a need for clearer boundaries.
Like specific areas.
Yeah. Could be in your relationships with family members or friends, colleagues at work, maybe your romantic partner, or even, honestly, in your interactions with technology these days.
Oh, good one. Tech boundaries.
Yeah. Identifying those specific areas where you consistently feel drained or resentful or perhaps taken advantage of, that can be really insightful.
That's great practical advice. Those feelings being drained, feeling resentful, they're often really good indicators that a boundary might be needed or maybe needs reinforcing.
Exactly. They're like little warning signals. So as we wrap up this deep dive today, let's just briefly revisit the 3 types of boundaries we've talked about.
Okay, quick recap.
We have rigid boundaries, which can feel like those impenetrable walls, often hindering genuine connection.
The fortress.
Then there are diffused boundaries, which are porous and unclear, often leading to overextension and that feeling of being overwhelmed.
The sponge.
Yeah, good analogy. And finally, we have healthy boundaries, which represent that vital balance, allowing for both meaningful connection and a strong, secure sense of self.
The flexible fence, maybe.
I like that. And recognizing these patterns, identifying where your own tendencies might lie, that is really the first most significant step toward building more fulfilling relationships and cultivating greater self-respect. Precisely. So for you listening, consider this as we finish. What is one small, manageable step you can take this week? Just one thing.
A small step.
To communicate or maybe reinforce a boundary in one of your relationships. It doesn't have to be a major confrontation, just a clear, kind expression of a need or a limit.
Okay.
Take a moment, maybe after this, to think about what might shift even slightly as a result of that single intentional action.